Hi, I'm Pete Hazelton. I'm the aquatic ecologist for the Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program with Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife. Part of my job responsibilities are managing and researching the conservation of freshwater mussels, fish, dragonflies, and other aquatic animals in the state listed under the Massachusetts Endangered Species Act. Here in the Nissitissit River, we've got two species of listed freshwater mussels that live both upstream and downstream of the dam that's going to be removed. Our role, and my role in particular on this project, is to manage those populations from any harm that may come from the dam removal. We think that ultimately, in the long run, the habitat in the river, the new habitat that's created when the dam is removed, will benefit the mussels. But in the short term, we have to make sure that the mussels are safe and removed from any immediate changes in habitat. What we're working on right now is setting up long-term study plots that we can define what the habitat looks like and the mussel densities are in the river. And we're removing those animals of 4 target species. 2 are listed under the Massachusetts Endangered Species Act, and the other 2 species are of conservation interest to us. And we're removing those species out of harm's way and putting them in refuge habitat far upstream of the reach of the impoundment. So the process of translocating the animals includes searching an area of river visually and tactily with our hands and finding the rare species. Once we find them, we'll take data on them, including their length, their condition, and their shell height. We'll tag them with an individual identifier, and at the end of the day, we translocate these animals to habitat upstream where we know that these animals already occur. So each of the animals that are in our long-term study plots of our 4 target species, and also the study plots upstream, and the animals that we're moving to those, are going to be tagged with an individual number. They're little plastic tags that have a unique identification number. They're a commercial shellfish tag that might be used in commercial shell fishery operations. The simple way to tag them is to just dry off a piece of the shell, and we use super glue, a dab of super glue, and glue that plastic tag right to its shell. We can then track whether the animal is growing, whether it's still alive in years to come, which will aid us in long-term monitoring of the population. In general, most freshwater mussel species live around 15 to 20 years, and that's true of 3 of our target species, including the state endangered Brook Floater. Another species that's a target on this study, the pearl shell, eastern pearl shell, lives as long as 50 to 70 years in Massachusetts. In parts of Europe, it's been aged around 100 to 200 years old. The monitoring of these populations is going to be a long-term process. That's because of the dam removal, but also because these populations are fairly rare across the state. So by tagging them and monitoring their age, we'll be able to monitor the population for a much longer period, and will aid for conservation planning of these species throughout the state for a much longer period than just the initial dam removal. One of our target species that we're relocating and studying in the Nissitissit River is the Brook Floater. The scientific name is Elasmodonta varicosa. It's one of the 3 state endangered species on freshwater mussel species on the Massachusetts Endangered Species Act. This species has been brought up or reviewed for federal endangerment status more than once already. Throughout its range on the East Coast, and particularly in New England, it's in decline. We want to monitor this population in the Nissitissit River because it's one of only 4 populations in the state. By understanding how habitat may become improved by the dam removal, we want to know what the habitat looks like before and after the dam removal and how that may change over time. The species requires moving or flowing, clean, freshwater systems, a good mixture of sediment quality and quantity and sizes, from boulders to cobble and gravel and sand. And those types of habitats can change in areas of an impoundment that becomes full of smaller sediment sizes and slower water flows, to downstream from a dam that is predominantly larger sediment sizes, bedrock and boulder, and does not have a lot of the smaller sediments that this animal can really dig into. So a mixture of those sediment classes is really what we believe and what we hope we'll see in the long run that will provide habitat for this species in generations to come. This is a depth to refusal, a very scientific tool, shoving an aluminum bar as hard as you can into the sediment. This is a very simple way of doing it. It's a relative estimate of how penetrable the sediment is so that the mussel can burrow down into it. And I take the depth and that penetration characteristic in 3 different locations. One is at the mussel and then 2 of the quadrats. What I'm doing now is looking at the relative composition of the sediment types of their sizes. So boulder, bedrock, gravel, sands, that sort of thing. So now I'm excavating the sediments down to about 4 or 5 inches to see if I find any mussels that are buried in the sediments that I didn't see visually when I snorkeled over them. My advisor for my PhD called them rocks with guts. You study them for a while and they become a little bit more endearing than that.
Yeah, a little bit.
So freshwater mussels are important because they are a filter feeding animal in our water bodies. They can remove an incredible amount of algae, bacteria, and other particles from the water and clean the water column. They're a very important aspect of that food chain and of that ecosystem as ecosystem engineers. They can also stabilize the sediment in a system, and they can actually increase the oxygenation of sediments, which are all part of the ecosystem itself, which includes both biological and geochemical processes to provide the unique system that is the Nissitissit River. Mussels will filter out not only algae, but they'll also filter out bacteria, even harmful bacteria like E. coli, and they'll ingest that bacteria and degrade it. So they can completely remove bacteria from the system, effectively cleaning the water and making it better water. You get an idea of the different shape of them. The Brook Floater is much more rounded up top. Other characteristics are the sort of level of inflation in the shell. You can see that the floater is much thicker from the top than the pearl shell. The floater kind of curves under, is somewhat concave on the ventral surface here, and has this strong ridge here, whereas the pearl shell doesn't have really that ridge. Pearl shell comes down to a little bit of a scoop and a point, almost triangular there in the front, whereas the Brook Floater is much more strongly hooked. I try to also write down a somewhat categorical level of shell condition, and meaning about how eroded or intact the shell is. And this one I would call about a 4 or a 5, because it's lost a significant area of the periostracum surface area, but is also some erosion in the shell right here where there's actually some cavities in the shell. So it's hard to tell whether that's a condition really of health or whether it's just age and wear on the animal. But I try to keep track of that in any mussel that I tag.
That would affect it.
So because of the Nissitissit River and the beautiful lands around it that are part of the wildlife management area, it gets a lot of use. It's located very close to Pepperell, right in town here. It runs right through down to Main Street where it joins the Nashua River. There's a lot of use on both the DFW lands and adjacent lands that could affect the habitat quality in the long term. We don't always just want to remove the dam now, but we want to make sure that habitat is here for these species, these rare species, for generations to come. Certain activities, although they're approved in the wildlife management area, perhaps should have a little bit better focus. We often have hiking or horseback riding on the wildlife management area, which are allowed activities. We'd love for people to come and enjoy the wildlife management areas. But we ask that you limit the amount that you trample through the water if you don't need to. Don't cross the river if you can cross the river on a road, particularly horses. Horses can have a detrimental effect on mussels and their habitat, both from adding nutrients to the water when they defecate or urinate, but also by trampling, they can harm mussels. So we'd appreciate that you left your horses on the trail. Fishing, please come and fish these waters. This is a wonderful fishery, especially up in the fly fishing only area. But please take into consideration that the fish are not the only animals in the river, and that the habitat we're trying to manage is to benefit other species, as well as the fish that we stock here and the native brook trout of Sucker Brook. ATV riding. Please keep the ATVs off of our WMAs. They aren't a sanctioned use of our property. They do degrade trails. They add sediment into our rivers. Please find other private lands away from the river to use off-road vehicles and ATVs.
Yeah.